She had 30 seconds before security would throw her out. He had 30 years of ignoring people like her. One desperate question from a homeless girl to a millionaire dining in luxury would expose a 7-year-old secret that destroyed her life. What happens when the victim confronts her destroyer? When desperation collides with guilt on Prague's golden streets? This is the moment that shatters everything and proves that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected place. The autumn rain had stopped, but Emma's torn clothes still clung to her shivering body like the nightmares she couldn't escape. 23 years old, she had been surviving on Prague's merciless streets for 8 brutal months, invisible to a world that stepped around her like she was just another piece of urban debris. Her reflection in shop windows told a story of systematic destruction. Hair that had once shone like honey was now matted and unwashed. Hands that had once worn diamond rings were now cracked and bleeding from digging through garbage bins. Eyes that had once sparkled with dreams now held the hollow stare of someone who had learned that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. She hadn't always been homeless. 8 months ago, she had been someone else entirely, someone with an apartment, a job, people who cared whether she lived or died. But that life felt like it belonged to another person, in another universe where fairness existed, and innocent people didn't have their entire existence stolen from them. Now she was a ghost haunting cobblestone streets, surviving on moldy bread and the occasional euro from tourists who bothered to see her humanity beneath the dirt and desperation. Through the restaurant's golden windows, she watched him with the focused intensity of a predator studying prey. James Morrison sat like a king in his kingdom, navy Armani suit that cost more than most people earned in 6 months, platinum Patek Philippe watch, catching the amber streetlight, cutting tender duck breast with the casual precision of someone who had never questioned where his next meal would come from. His manicured fingers moved with the unconscious grace of inherited privilege. Everything about him radiated untouchable wealth and power. Everything about her screamed forgotten, discarded, worthless. The contrast was a knife twisting in her chest. He existed in a bubble of crystal glasses, fine linen, and the gentle murmur of Prague's elite discussing their latest acquisitions, while she pressed her face against cold glass, her breath fogging the barrier between their worlds. Emma's stomach wasn't just empty, it was eating itself. 4 days without food had made her hands shake uncontrollably and her vision blur at the edges. That half-finished plate of duck sat there like a golden treasure, steam still rising from untouched roasted vegetables, while he scrolled through his phone with the bored indifference of someone who had never known want. She had watched him take exactly 3 bites before pushing the plate aside, the casual waste more infuriating than his wealth itself. Such thoughtless abundance, while she fought for every scrap just to survive another day. The security guard near the entrance was checking his watch, his predatory eyes scanning the street for undesirables like her. Her window was closing fast. If she was going to act, it had to be now, before courage abandoned her completely. Emma's bare feet were numb against the ancient cobblestones as she approached the glass door. Her heart hammered so hard, she thought it might burst as she gathered every molecule of strength left in her starving body. This was madness. This was desperation. This was her last chance, before another night of hunger tore through her belly like broken glass. She pushed through the door, feeling the restaurant's warmth embrace her frozen skin. Conversations in German, French, and English created the sophisticated symphony of international wealth. a world she had once belonged to, but could now only observe from the outside. Her voice cracked like autumn leaves as she spoke the 5 words that would change both their lives forever. "Can I eat your leftovers?" The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The entire terrace fell silent as if someone had cut the power to reality itself. Crystal glasses froze halfway to lips. Silver forks stopped midair. Every conversation died as all eyes turned toward her, some filled with disgust, others with pity, most with the uncomfortable recognition that their perfect evening had been invaded by the harsh reality they usually managed to ignore. James Morrison looked up from his phone for the first time in hours, and their eyes met across a chasm of privilege and pain. Her eyes were storm clouds full of rain that would never fall, and they held a hunger that went deeper than food. They held the weight of someone who had been broken by a system designed to protect people, exactly like him. The maitre d' was already moving toward them like a shark, sensing blood, his professional smile barely concealing his disgust. But James raised his hand, stopping the man mid-stride. Something in Emma's voice had reached through 7 years of carefully constructed emotional armor to touch a place in his chest he thought had died long ago. Despite the dirt and desperation, despite the torn coat and hollow cheeks, there was something in her bearing that spoke of better times, of a life that had been stolen rather than simply lost. But what James didn't know, what would destroy everything he thought he knew about his perfect life, was that Emma had recognized him the moment she saw him. Behind those storm cloud eyes lay a memory from 7 years ago that she had carried like poison in her veins. She wasn't just a random, homeless girl begging for scraps. She was the ghost of his worst sin come back to collect what he owed. The words had escaped James's lips before his brain could stop it, his voice sounding foreign in his own throat. Emma collapsed into the chair across from him like a marionette whose strings had been cut, and he pushed the plate toward her trembling hands with the automatic politeness his mother had drilled into him since childhood. She ate with the desperate efficiency of someone who had forgotten that food was meant to be savored rather than consumed as quickly as possible before it could be taken away. Each bite seemed to bring her back to life, color slowly returning to her pale cheeks. The other diners watched with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car accident. But James found himself studying her face with growing unease. Beneath the dirt and exhaustion, beneath the hollow cheeks and frightened eyes, there was something achingly familiar about her features. When he finally worked up the courage to ask her name, her answer hit him like a physical blow that knocked the air from his lungs. Emma Hartwell. The name detonated in his memory like a bomb, sending shrapnel through 7 years of carefully constructed denial. His fork clattered to the cobblestones, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden silence of his world collapsing. Emma Hartwell. The scholarship girl from the council estate who had been the brightest student at Cambridge. The one who could solve mathematical equations that left professors speechless and write essays that made grown men weep. His closest friend for 3 beautiful years before everything went catastrophically wrong. The blood drained from his face as she continued speaking, her voice suddenly different. No longer the broken whisper of a beggar, but the precise, educated tone of the brilliant woman he had once known and destroyed. She spoke of 7 years ago, before his father's lawyers had made her disappear from the world like she had never existed, before money and power had conspired to erase her from every system, every record, every trace of the life she had built with her own hands. She had been in prison, Holloway Prison for 3 years, for a crime she didn't commit, a crime his family had orchestrated her to take the fall for, while the real perpetrator walked free. James's hands began to shake as the memories flooded back, memories he had spent 7 years and hundreds of thousands of pounds in therapy trying to bury. The champagne in his glass caught the lamplight like liquid gold, but all he could taste was the metallic tang of guilt and shame. Emma's smile was a masterpiece of controlled rage, beautiful and terrible as a blade forged in the fires of injustice. When she leaned forward, her voice dropped to a whisper that cut through him like surgery without anesthesia. She told him she wanted to share a story, the story of the night his father chose to destroy an innocent woman, rather than let his precious heir face the consequences of his actions. The story of the night James stood by and watched it happen. The story of the night he was supposed to be her best friend, but chose his inheritance over her life. The night that had haunted James Morrison's dreams for 7 years was about to become the waking nightmare he could never escape. Emma's voice cut through the Prague evening like ice as she transported them back to Cambridge, May 2017. The night of the May ball when everything died in twisted metal and broken promises. James was 21, drunk on champagne, behind the wheel of his father's Bentley. The memory he had buried for 7 years clawed to the surface, screeching tires, the sickening crunch of metal meeting flesh. Sarah Mitchell, 20 years old, cycling home from the library. James had killed her instantly, but Daddy's money could fix anything, even murder. When police arrived, they found Emma behind the wheel instead. His father's security team had knocked her unconscious, dragged her to the scene, arranged her body while James was whisked to a private clinic. The setup was perfect. Emma was the ideal patsy, brilliant but poor, close enough to James to have motive for stealing his car. The trial was character assassination. They painted her as a jealous girl from the council estate who stole her better's car in rage. Emma spent 3 years in Holloway Prison for his crime. 3 years of being beaten, threatened, broken, while James finished university and started his perfect life. When released, she had nothing. Criminal record, no family, no future beyond the streets. 4 years homeless because of what he'd done. Emma reached into her coat and produced a smartphone. She had recorded everything. Tomorrow, the world would know exactly what kind of man James Morrison was. As Emma vanished into the Prague night, James realized his real nightmare wasn't the past. It was the future about to destroy him.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
James stumbled into the Prague night, Emma's words echoing in his skull like funeral bells. For 3 hours he wandered, remembering her as she used to be, the brilliant girl who could quote Chaucer and solve calculus in her head. His best friend, the one he had destroyed to save himself. He found her on a bench near Charlesbridge, staring at the river. Her phone lay in her lap, dried tears on her cheeks. When he said her name, she asked if he'd come to beg, threaten, or have her disappeared like his father used to do. James sat beside her and told her he'd come to apologize. Really apologize, without excuses. 7 years too late, she replied. He knew. He admitted he'd been a coward who let his father destroy an innocent woman to protect himself. The worst part, Emma said, hadn't been prison or the streets. It had been losing him, her best friend, the person she'd trusted most. James pulled out his phone and transferred £50 million to a new account, handing her the details. Emma stared in shock. The money wasn't enough. he said quietly. But it was a start. Tomorrow morning, he would hold a press conference and tell the world exactly what the Morrison family had done. His father was dead, but his legacy of corruption wasn't. It was time to burn it all down. But as James walked away, neither noticed the figure watching from the shadows, someone who would ensure this confession never saw daylight. The attack came from behind with professional precision. Emma was walking back to her doorway when the black van appeared. 3 masked men grabbed her, throwing her inside. Her phone, with its precious recording, was smashed on the cobblestones. She woke in a warehouse, zip-tied to a chair. A man in an expensive suit sat across from her, smoking. "Miss Hartwell, Marcus Webb. I work for the Morrison family." Emma's blood turned to ice. She recognized him, her father's old security chief, the architect of her framing. Marcus explained that James had shared his confession plan. The Morrison empire was worth £50 billion. They couldn't let one weak moment destroy everything. Emma would disappear permanently. James would get over his guilt eventually. Rich boys always did. But Marcus had underestimated James Morrison's transformation. The money transfer had included tracking access. When Emma's GPS signal vanished, every alarm screamed. The warehouse door exploded inward. James stood flanked by 8 security contractors, his face cold fury incarnate. The confrontation would determine whether justice could finally triumph over 3 generations of corruption. The standoff lasted exactly 47 seconds, but each one felt like an eternity, suspended between justice and catastrophe. Marcus Webb's hand moved toward his concealed weapon with the confidence of someone who had eliminated dozens of problems over the decades. But he was a relic from an analog age, facing digital-era precision. James's security team surrounded him with military efficiency, laser sights painting red dots across his expensive suit like bloody stars. The old man's face drained of color as he realized he was facing something he had never encountered before. A Morrison who was willing to sacrifice everything for something other than money and power. James cut Emma's restraints himself, his hands gentle despite their trembling with suppressed rage. She wasn't physically harmed, but he could see layers of fresh trauma settling over the old scars like sediment in a riverbed. Every betrayal, every moment of powerlessness, every instant when the system had failed her, was written in the lines around her storm-cloud eyes. He explained how he had found her, his voice steady, despite the fury burning in his chest. The money transfer had included tracking access to her phone's GPS coordinates. When her signal vanished from a location she had no reason to leave, every alarm in his security network had screamed like the end of the world. The same technology that had once been used to monitor and control enemies was now her salvation. Marcus was led away in restraints, his empire of shadows finally dragged into the light. As the police loaded him into their van, he looked back at James with something that might have been respect, or might have been the recognition that the world had changed and left him behind. The old guard was falling. The new one would be built on different principles entirely. 6 months later, James stood before an ocean of cameras and microphones in London's most prestigious hotel, Emma beside him, in an elegant midnight blue dress that transformed her from victim to victor, from beggar to advocate, from ghost to goddess of justice. The transformation was so complete, it took the breath away. The girl who had once pressed her face against restaurant windows was now addressing world leaders, CEOs, and justice ministers from 6 continents. The Morrison family empire had indeed crumbled with spectacular completeness within weeks of his confession. The board had fired him unanimously in an emergency session. Shareholders had fled like rats from a sinking ship. The stock price had cratered faster than anyone thought possible, and criminal charges had been filed against 17 family members across 3 generations. But for the first time in 7 years, James could look at himself in the mirror without flinching. His reflection showed someone he actually respected. Emma had used her settlement money, £200 million in total, to create something unprecedented, the Hartwell Foundation for Justice Reform. In 6 months, they had helped over 800 wrongfully convicted people rebuild their lives, providing legal aid, housing assistance, job training, psychological support, and, most importantly, the dignity of being seen as human beings rather than statistics. Each person helped was a small victory against a system designed to protect the powerful and discard the inconvenient. James, stripped of his inheritance but not his skills or determination, had founded Justice Tech Solutions, creating artificial intelligence systems that analyzed case files, identified potential errors, flagged prosecutorial misconduct, and prevented wrongful convictions before they could destroy innocent lives. His first client had been Emma's foundation. Together, they were revolutionizing the justice system from the ground up, turning technology into a weapon for the powerless rather than a tool for oppression. The transformation was complete and profound. The privileged heir who had once lived off the blood money was now fighting for those society had forgotten. The homeless girl who had once begged for scraps was now one of the most powerful voices for justice reform in the world. They walked onto the stage together where Emma would receive the International Human Rights Award for her groundbreaking work with imprisoned populations. The same platform where, just 6 months earlier, she had been invisible and voiceless, was now her pulpit for addressing the world's most powerful institutions. As they waited in the wings, James reflected on that night in Prague that had changed everything. What if she hadn't found the courage to ask for his leftovers? What if he had ignored her like every other wealthy person had? What if security had dragged her away before she could speak the words that shattered his world? Emma took his hand and told him that then neither of them would have found their way home. Home wasn't a place. It was the peace that comes from living with integrity, from using your gifts to heal rather than harm, from knowing that your existence makes the world better rather than worse. The applause that greeted them was thunderous, but more importantly, it was earned. The cameras flashed like stars being born, but for the first time in either of their lives, the attention felt deserved rather than inherited or stolen. In the audience, families of the wrongfully convicted wept with gratitude for advocates who understood their pain. Former prisoners who had found new lives through Emma's foundation stood and cheered for the woman who had given them hope when the world had abandoned them. Legal professionals who had been inspired by James's transformation applauded the possibility of redemption even for those who seemed beyond saving. This was what justice looked like when it finally arrived. Not perfect, not complete, but real and growing stronger every day, spreading like light through cracks in a system that had been broken for too long. As Emma stepped to the microphone to address the world, James realized that the girl who had asked for leftovers had ended up serving a banquet of hope to everyone who had been forgotten, discarded, and written off by a society that measured worth in bank balances rather than human dignity. Sometimes the most powerful question isn't, "What do you want?" but, "What are you willing to lose to do what's right?" Sometimes love begins with the simplest act of human kindness, shared between strangers on the coldest night. Sometimes the most important conversation in the world starts with someone swallowing their pride and asking for help. And sometimes, when good people choose courage over comfort and justice over convenience, miracles happen. Not just for them, but for everyone watching, everyone hoping, everyone still fighting for their own second chance at dignity and truth. The girl who asked for leftovers had changed the world, one act of courage at a time. This story isn't just entertainment. It's a mirror reflecting choices we make every day. Right now, there are millions like Emma, invisible in our cities, their potential buried beneath circumstances beyond their control. And people like James, carrying guilt and searching for redemption. Think about the last time you walked past someone asking for help. What story did you tell yourself? What assumptions did you make? What if you were wrong? Share your story in the comments. Tell us about a time you chose compassion over comfort, when you saw past appearance to humanity. Maybe you've been the one needing help, judged by circumstances rather than character. How did recognition change your life? If you're struggling right now, feeling invisible like Emma on those Prague streets, your current situation is not your final destination. Your story isn't over. Subscribe because you're committing to see the world differently. Like this video if it changed something in you. Share it with someone who needs to remember that kindness is never wasted. More importantly, act. Find a local shelter, legal aid society, justice reform organization. Volunteer. Donate. Use your voice and privilege to lift someone up. Remember, you have the power to be someone's reason to believe in humanity again. You never know which small act of courage changes everything. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. For stories that transform hearts and prove love conquers hate, one connection at a time. The change starts now. The change starts with you.